Welcome to this module, which is titled The Analogical Imagination. Now that's a mouthful, I realize, and I'll explain the meaning of the seemingly complicated title for this module, but let's just get our bearings first. What we're going to do now, from now until the end of this course, is we're going to be focusing on the RCIA. Now, you've gone to the workshops, or you can go to workshops that explain the RCIA process in detail, that explain all the different rites and the different symbols and celebrations that comprise the RCIA. You can go and find out how to do the RCIA somewhere else. You don't have to be in a graduate program in theology to, go to these workshops from the North American Forum or wherever. What I want to do in this module and the following ones is to give you a better historical sense of the RCIA, to give you more of a liturgical foundation for the RCIA. And I want to start with this module on the analogical imagination. Now, what does this mean? If you've been working in the RCIA, you probably have seen the fact that most people coming to you are Protestants. Most are Christians from another denomination. Protestants who are joining the Catholic Church make up the bulk of the RCIA process, more than the unbaptized, although I have to admit that the number of the unbaptized that are out there is rising, which that's very disconcerting as well. But most of the people that you'll see every year in the RCIA are Protestants coming for full communion with the Catholic Church. So, to enter into this unit on the RCIA, let me start with this question. Do Protestants and Catholics look at things differently? And the answer is a resounding yes. The difference between Protestants and Catholics, it's not so much on doctrine, and it's not so much on ethics. The fundamental difference between Protestants and Catholics is we see things differently. We look at God a little differently. We have two different pictures of God in our heads. There's a Catholic picture and a Protestant picture in our heads. Now, please do not misunderstand me. It's one God. I'm not suggesting that one is better than the other of these two, although one tends to dominate in the Catholic tradition and another picture dominates in the Protestant tradition. Both of these images of God that we're going to look at can be found in both traditions. Both can be found in the same person. There are two different images, pictures, really, that we have of God. And the two pictures are, one is called the analogical, and that refers to Catholics, and the other is the dialectical. So you'll see materials about the analogical imagination, or the Catholic imagination, or the sacramental imagination. They're really all saying the same thing. Catholics look at God and the world differently than do Protestants. Catholics see with what's called the analogical imagination. Protestants look at God and the world through the dialectical imagination. Now, where do these tongue-twisting terms come from? Well, it was David Tracy up at the University of Chicago who wrote a book called The Analogical Imagination. And he is the one who has given us some very rich theology in terms of how Catholics look at things differently than do Protestants. Again, I'm not saying one is better than the other, although I'm a Catholic, obviously, so you can tell the way that I look at the world, and I'm quite partial to it, I will admit. But I don't want to say one is better than the other. I'm going to say both need each other, or both can complement each other, although one of the two tends to dominate in any given person. So I think as we enter into this module, it's important for you to understand how Protestants look at things, and I think this will help you understand them and serve them better as they come to you in the RCIA. Okay, let's look at this difference between the analogical and the dialectical imagination, and where did David Tracy, how did he come up with these two terms? Well, what he did was he looked at religious classics from both traditions. So from the Catholic tradition, it was Dante's Divine Comedy. Just a magnificent Catholic work of art, a Catholic masterpiece, Dante's Divine Comedy. But then in Protestant circles, Bunyan's Pilgrim's Progress, a classic of Protestant spiritual devotion. And what he did was he looked at all these religious classics in the Protestant tradition and in the Catholic tradition, more than just these two books, but I'm just using them for the sake of example. But he looked at what were these Catholic masterpieces and these Protestant masterpieces. And he started to analyze them, and he started to see certain patterns. And what he started to notice was the Catholic classics all operate out of what he calls the analogical imagination, and the Protestant classics all operated out of what he called the dialectical imagination. Okay, let me define these terms for you. The analogical imagination comes from the word analogy. And what is any analogy? An analogy is a comparison between two things in which the likeness of the two terms is what is most important. So an analogy, you can think of any analogy. I mean, you did this in English class, but an analogy in theology might be God's grace is like water. Okay, so water is in our experience. We know what water is. We understand water. And so by making this analogy, this comparison, God's grace is like water, well, we get that as Catholics. It washes away sin, it brings new life, it restores, it refreshes, all the things that water do. Grace is like that, we might say. That's an analogy. And so Catholic theology is filled with these kinds of analogies. But notice they're analogies and not equivalences. We don't say God's grace is water. We say God's grace is like water. If it was an equivalence, we'd say God's grace is water. But that's not it. We're saying God's grace is like water, which is an analogy. Again, it emphasizes the likeness between the two elements being compared. Now, there's, of course, a dissimilarity. And we get that because, again, they're not strictly equal to each other. But an analogy doesn't focus on what's dissimilar. It focuses on what is similar. Now, because there's always this little element of dissimilarity, or even a big element of dissimilarity in any analogy, every analogy breaks down at some point. And so probably a very poignant analogy that doesn't work for everybody is to say God is like a father. Now, if you had a good, loving, great father, you're very much at home with that analogy. If you did not have such a good and loving father, that can have serious repercussions for you in your spiritual life. When you hear God is like a father, and if your father was not good and loving and supportive, well, then you have all of these negative images of God in your mind just from this analogy. So not every analogy works based on our experience, and every analogy breaks down. But still, what an analogy does is it focuses on what is like between the two things being compared. That's the analogical imagination. The dialectical sees the opposite. It sees what is dissimilar. It doesn't focus on what is similar in any comparison. It notices what is dissimilar, and it emphasizes what is dissimilar. And so the dialectical imagination does not use analogies. Instead, because you can't compare the two, they're so different, the dialectical imagination says. Okay, that's just a very brief definition. Let's apply this now. Let's compare the analogical and the dialectical imagination. The analogical imagination, the Catholic imagination, the Catholic view of things is we believe that God is present in the world. That we believe that the created things around us can tell us something of God, not the whole story, and there's obviously a dissimilarity, but we do believe that because God is present in the world, that the created world can tell us something of the beauty and the splendor and the majesty of God. We believe that God is present in the world because that's the analogical imagination. The dialectical imagination sees not God's presence, but God's absence, that God is not in the world. And so the Protestant imagination doesn't see God in the world. Instead, the Protestant imagination sees God as transcendent, as above the world. Not so much in the world, instead of all holy and all transcendent and above the world. The Catholic view of things is, of course, God is above the world and holy, but the Catholic view sees God in the world as well, in the sacraments. God's grace coming to us through created realities, through things like bread and wine and oil and water and all the things we use in the sacraments. We have this sacramental view because we believe that God is present in the world. The dialectical view sees God as totally different from the world and above the world and not in the world. So, the word for the dialectical imagination is the transcendence of God. That's what it sees. The Catholic view sees the immanence of God, that God is intimately lurking in the world, that God is present in the world, that we are surrounded by the grace of God. The dialectical imagination does not see that. It sees God not surrounding us, but above and away from us. So, because we believe, Catholics do, that God is present in the world, we can use analogies, we can make connections between the things of the world. They can tell us something of God, because we do believe that God is present among us. Not so with Protestant theology. Because God is so absent, there are no comparisons that can be made. So Protestant theology rarely uses any analogy in its theologizing when it does it. Okay, again, the Catholic view obviously acknowledges the difference between God and the world, but it still focuses more on the likeness. The Protestant view is the flip side. It sees more distance, more dissimilarity than it does similarity between God and the world. Okay, because Catholics see God present in the world, we have a strong emphasis on community. Because God is here with us, among us, we have a strong focus on community and the communal dimension and the church. The Protestant imagination sees God not so much around us. God's up and above us, but not so much around us. And so the Protestant view lessens the importance of the church. The church is not what is important in many Protestant minds because God is not so present among us as we believe he is as Catholics. So Protestants, as you can see, emphasize the individual. Individualism is extremely important in Protestant thought, whereas, as you can see where I'm going, Catholics emphasize the communal, the community, the church, because we believe that God is truly present among us. And so because Catholics focus on the communal dimension, things like loyalty to the church, obedience to the church, thinking with the church, orthodoxy. These are values for Catholics, but they're not for Protestants because they don't have this same emphasis on the church because they believe God is distant and above us, but not among us. So not so much of an emphasis on the church in Protestant thought. Likewise, orthodoxy is not so important for Protestant thinkers. Doctrine is not so important among Protestant thinkers. Again, look at all the non-denominational churches that have sprung up just in the last 20 years. And a lot of these places will say that they are non-doctrinal, non-dogmatic. Some of them you can barely recognize as Christian. I mean, some of the names just don't even say anything explicitly Christian, like New Spring or New Life. They're churches, but doctrine and dogma, institutional institutional heritage, not so important. And these non-denominational, non-dogmatic, non-doctrinal churches, which would have seemed an impossibility 500 years ago. Okay, because there's less emphasis on the communal, more emphasis on the individual in Protestant thought, there's more of an emphasis on individual freedom among Protestants. Individual freedom is much more important for those who are Protestants, for those who look at things with the dialectical imagination. The Catholic view is the emphasis is not on the individual, but on the common good. How often do we hear that in Catholic social teaching, this emphasis on the common good? It's because Well, now you can see where it comes from, because God is present and the community is so important that the common good is a key category in Catholic social teaching. We have a county commissioner who just recently said he believes the common good is a collectivist myth. Now, I don't want to get too political here, but I just want to say there are folks who do not believe in the common good. They just think it has no value. Why? Because the individual has the value. Individual property rights, individual rights. It's the individual that is supreme in the dialectical approach to things. It's the community that is supreme in the analogical approach to things. So because we believe and see God, presence of God all around us, we see the world as good. That's how the analogical imagination looks at things. The world is basically good. It's fallen, all right. I mean, there's no denying that. It's fallen, but it's not wretched. It's not God forsaken. It is, creation has been impaired, but it's not emptied out of the presence of God. The Protestant theology, the dialectical imagination, believes that is exactly the case. This is a God-forsaken world. It is a sin-filled world, which only highlights the need for redemption in Jesus Christ. So you can see how the dialectical view of things is operating. This emphasis in Protestant thought on the absence of God, the exaltation of the individual, this is where we get the Protestant work ethic. If God is forsaken the world, basically, if God isn't present in the community, if it's the individual that matters, well, then individual integrity and ambition and work and success, this is why the Protestant work ethic, this is where it comes from. Because you have to prove that you're worthy. If God isn't surrounding you with His grace like Catholics believe, how can you know that you're saved? Where is the proof of your salvation? Well, you can prove it by showing signs of God's blessing, which is, viewed as prosperity. And so if you're prosperous, God has obviously blessed you, and this is a sign of your salvation if you have been successful, and you make a lot of money, and you have a lot of nice things. That's what drives the Protestant work ethic, this individual, I've got to prove my worth, and it's what drives a lot of prosperity gospel messages of today. Again, how do you know that you're blessed by God? Well, one palpable sign of His blessing is to have all of these material blessings around you. The Catholic view of things is just not that. I mean, we don't have the individual work ethic like you do like is seen in Protestant circles. Now, we live in a basically Protestant nation, so even Catholics have imbued some of that Protestant work ethic over here. But this is still foreign to a Catholic look at things, which emphasizes not the individual, but the communal. And there's no doubt about the presence of God. There's no need to prove it, as some Protestant Christians have really had to work overtime to prove. That's just not operating in Catholic circles. Okay, so this has led to some really interesting sociological studies, and Andrew Greeley has done some of this. I'll put one of his articles on the syllabus for you. But he notes there's higher achievement in Protestant circles. That should not be surprising given the Protestant work ethic. But there's also higher suicide rates among Protestants. Again, because if you believe deep down in your bones that God has forsaken the world, that it's a sin-filled world, and there's all this pressure on you to prove otherwise, I mean, it makes sense why despair could creep in. Protestants also acknowledge on surveys a higher degree of loneliness than do Catholics. Again, it makes sense. The emphasis is on the individual in the dialectical imagination because, well, I've explained that several times now already. I should say Catholics have caught up with Protestants in terms of attainment here in the United States, which is a mixed blessing, I think, but I don't want to leave you with too many stereotypes here, but this is the latest sociological analysis from Andrew Greeley. So, the dialectical approach, the focus is on the individual, so integrity, ambition, initiative, drive. This is what matters. Sins against personal integrity are a big deal in Protestantism. So lying, personal dishonesty, these are the things that really cut to the quick of the Protestant soul. In Catholic circles, again, it's not initiative and drive and that kind of work ethic. Instead, loyalty is what is valued, obedience to the church, patience even. They say that Catholics can be more greatly disappointed in their church because they expect so much from their church. Protestants are not so easily disappointed because they don't have those same kinds of expectations. And so, again, the tragedy of the clergy sexual crisis, it's really shaken Catholics to the core here in the United States and around the world, again, because we place such a value on the church and on the community. And when these sins against the community become just so tragically apparent, well, it shakes everybody who's a Catholic. Again, not to say that nobody else cares about it quite like we do, but I think you can see that, again, given the Catholic emphasis on the community, on the church, when the church fails her people, it shakes Catholics to the core. Protestants are somewhat protected from that. I mean, we had Jim and Tammy Faye Baker. We've had, scandals, Jimmy Swaggart, all of that in Protestant circles as well. It doesn't shake them so much because they don't put the emphasis on the church. And so when their disappointment happens, it doesn't register quite as deeply among them. I know that's a huge generalization, but it's trying to, again, make the point of this distinction between the analogical and the dialectical. Okay, I think one way to maybe visualize it is look at these two images. Here we have an image, I think, of the analogical imagination, that God in the white field, the white color, just surrounds the world, that God permeates the world, that God is present to the world, that God surrounds the world. The dialectical imagination would see the relationship between God and the world more like this. This is a painting by Mark Rothko, but see how separate they are? See how God is up above and separate from the world? This would be more of a Protestant view of things, that they believe in God, of course, don't get me wrong, but they have God up there and transcendent, and God's grace is a very rare thing. The miraculous is very rare. They just don't see that here. Instead, God and the world are much more separated from each other. Now you can see how, if this is the Protestant view of things, how easy it is to move from this, in which there is still a strong belief in God, to secularism. Secularism that denies God. I mean, if the Protestant Reformation for the first time started looking at the world as God forsaken or as God absent from the world, it's a short step to where we are today with secularism, in which God is completely denied or God's presence is just not acknowledged at all. So it's a commonplace in church history that Protestantism, the reforms were needed at the beginning, but the unintended tragic consequence of the Protestant Reformation is the secularism that we see just rampant around us today. Okay, I've given you these two images that help symbolize or depict the two different imaginations. Let's look at some church interiors. I think this will continue to drive home the point. Here's a very beautiful, obviously Catholic church interior. When you look at this, when you walk into a church like this, everybody automatically knows this is a Catholic church. Again, this is the analogical imagination that sees God at work all around us, that sees the grace of God surrounding us, that sees the grace of God in the great saints, the great communion of saints that surrounds us. When you walk into a Catholic church, you know it right away. Here's a picture of a very standard non-denominational church today. Again, extremely different view of things. And when I was teaching undergraduates, we did to make this point, we go on a little church tour in town. We do a field trip to the cathedral, and it was much like the church on the previous slide. And then I'd take them to a non-denominational church, like this one. We went to one out on Maze Road, and we walked in, and it looked very much like the image you just saw. You walk into the church, and it's really a worship space and a basketball court all at the same time. They had the lines for a basketball down on the floor. They didn't take them up. They just put chairs on top of them. The basketball goals were on either side. They were moved up to the ceiling, but they were still hanging up there. And then they just had a stage with the pulpit. That was it. Now the Catholic kids, of course, and I set them up, obviously we went to the cathedral first, and then we walked into this non-denominational, this very nondescript church, and they all had the predictable reaction like, oh. But then we ran into one of the youth pastors at this non-denominational church, and they asked him, they said something like, is this really a church? He goes, oh yeah. He goes, but we make no bones about this being a sacred space, because we don't consider this a sacred space at all. We're not under any illusions that this church is the sacred space. He said, what's sacred is in our heart. That's where the sacred lies, within each individual. And they had a very active outreach to homeless people, to single mothers. There were sacks of food lining the hallways of this place that we walked into. So there was a lot of Christian activism as well there that was very commendable. But he made no bones about the fact that the church wasn't what was sacred. They didn't see God surrounding them like a Catholic would. Instead, they see the sacred within. Now, I'm not saying that that's wrong, or I'm not denigrating that. But when you look at a Catholic church, again, let's just look at another image here. The beauty of this. I wouldn't want to be without this. I think in Catholicism, when we're at our best, it's both and. It's not either or. So God dwelling within our hearts, we would hold to that as well. But I wouldn't want to lose this either. Andrew Greeley has a quote that, let me read this to you as you just look at the images here. Andrew Greeley says this. He wrote a book in 2003 called The Catholic Imagination, and it's basically a popular presentation of David Tracy's really difficult book, The Analogical Imagination. But here's what Father Andrew Greeley said in The Catholic Imagination. Catholics live in an enchanted world, a world of statues and holy water, stained glass and votive candles, saints and religious medals, rosary beads and holy pictures. But these Catholic paraphernalia are mere hints of a deeper and more pervasive religious sensibility, which inclines Catholics to see the holy lurking in creation. As Catholics, we find our houses and our world haunted by a sense that the objects, events, and persons of daily life are revelations of grace. This is taking us to really the heart of things that I hope will be helpful to you as you continue to work in the RCIA, to understand what's called the sacramental imagination. This is the Catholic take on things. This is the Catholic view of things. And this is what we're trying to give to the Protestants who come to us in the RCIA, who want to join the Catholic Church and enter into full communion with her. The analogical imagination, the Catholic imagination, believes and sees God present in the world, that God can work in and through the world. And so in John chapter 9, verse 6, when Jesus uses mud, he mixes and creates mud as a healing salve over the blind man. That doesn't strike us as all that odd at all, because we have this sacramental view of things where God can work through material things like bread and wine and oil and water and all the rest. Or in Mark's Gospel, Mark 8, verse 23, when Jesus uses his own spittle to create this healing salve. Again, it's pretty graphic, I'll admit, but it's very much a Catholic view of things, that God's grace can come to us through material things and through the stuff of this world that is good, fallen, true, but still good, that God created. God's grace can operate in and through the sacraments, which utilize the material stuff of God's creation. Not so in the Protestant denominations. I mean, the sacraments, especially in the mainstream churches, they'll have a few. The ones that are most explicitly mentioned in Scripture, baptism and Eucharist. But of course, they have let the other sacraments go, or they've greatly downplayed them. Again, because they look at things differently. They don't see God working in the world like we do. They don't see God working through the world, through the material elements of the world. This is the heart of what Catholicism is this sacramental view of God working through the material world that God created. Okay, just a bit about grace here. I mean, if Protestants don't see God working in the world with the regularity that Catholics do, they do, of course, believe that grace can work. It's just so sporadic. It's just so rare. It's just so uncommon. And so, well, in the words of that Protestant classic, Amazing Grace, how precious did that grace appear the hour I first believed. As if grace was just a first-time event in this person's life. As if grace were quite sporadic, very irregular. Just this rare visitation from God. Catholics believe it's on a daily basis that God's grace can come to us and work in our lives and replenish them. So if the Protestant tendency is to see that God hardly ever works in our life, it's just these rare events in which grace can happen, the Catholic danger is that it's all routine, that it just becomes automatic or almost mechanical. So there's a Catholic danger as well to seeing God at work in our world. We can take it for granted, or we can just, again, become quite numb to the routine of it if we're not careful. So maybe you can see there's always the need for both, the analogical and the dialectical. But I think you can also see how these two different viewpoints shape people. So Catholics are surrounded by loveliness. They are surrounded by grace-filled, graceful images. Again, the churches, especially before Vatican II, again, what happened after Vatican II is the dialectical imagination took hold. And so a lot of things were cleared out. There was, again, a stripping down of the churches. That was the dialectical imagination in the ascendancy. Now, what it can do, what it can help us do, is it can kind of help clear away some of the clutter and clear away some of the extraneous. But I think you can see that in the last 10, 20 years, the analogical imagination has been reasserting itself in Catholic circles. And so all of those churches that were built in the 60s and 70s, we're not doing that quite so severely like we used to do right after the council. Instead, again, the analogical imagination, the Catholic imagination is resurfacing and reasserting itself. And there's been a helpful function after Vatican II, I think, in pruning away some of the excess, but we don't want to prune it down to the quick of the plant, which is kind of what happened in some churches right after the council. Again, I think you can see that the dialectical imagination is starting. It served its helpful purpose right after Vatican II, but it's starting to recede, and the Catholic analogical imagination is reasserting itself. Catholics are surrounded by grace-filled, graceful images. So remember back in the year 2000 when that Y2K paranoia was spreading, it didn't really do much in Catholic circles. I mean, nobody really took that seriously, like some Protestant circles did, because we believe God is just always permeating our lives. The rapture, again, this never really has been developed in Catholic theology. You know what the rapture is, that at the end of the world, which could happen before you finish watching this module, Jesus could come back, and then the good will be snatched up into the air. They will be seized. That's where the word rapture comes from, rapere in Latin. They will be seized and taken up with them, and then all the wicked will be left behind. Hundreds of millions of copies of that rapture series called Left Behind sold. Well, you can see why this would be more attractive to Protestant eyes, because if God has forsaken the world, there's this desire for God to return, and now, and right away. But Catholics don't think God left us to begin with, and so the rapture's never gained any traction among Catholic circles. Again, trying to show you why some of these differences between Catholics and Protestants are there because of our different view of the relationship between God and the world. Okay, let's try to start to sum up some of these things. Let's look at some of the strengths and the weaknesses of the two approaches. Again, we need both. I'm not saying one is better than the other, although I obviously am more attracted to one than the other. But with respect to the analogical imagination, again, as I just mentioned right after Vatican II, the dialectical imagination can help prune away some things that can just be accretions or things that can just grow up over time. It can also prune away some of the tendency to kind of, let's just call it superstition. You know, if you bury the St. Joseph statue in your backyard, either face up or face down, I never can get that right. That's supposed to help you sell your house. You know, it doesn't bother me when I hear people say that. I mean, I think that's a kind of a folk religion. I think it's kind of a Catholic part of Catholic culture, but you know, it approaches superstition. The dialectical imagination can help prune away some of these things in our lives or in the practice of our religion and help us focus on the essentials. The analogical imagination can help Protestants with a sense of joy and beauty and the communal dimension that's often missing in their individualistic approach. The Catholic imagination, Catholicism is all about optimism and joy and celebration. There's this famous poem by Hilaire Belloc, "Wherever the Catholic sun does shine is plenty of laughter and good red wine." That's a real Catholic take on things. That there's a joy to living, that this is a good world. It's fallen. We are prone to sin. We do sin. There are problems. I'm not denying any of that. But still, the world is basically good and life is good. And this is sometimes overlooked or diminished in Protestant circles. Again, there can be sort of this darker take on things in some Protestant circles, again, because of the dialectical imagination. When things are too dire, this is how I think the Catholic Church can help those coming to full communion who are Protestants. Let me just emphasize that point. Really, the main point of this module is to help you see some of the underlying differences between the Catholic take on things and the Protestant, so that you can help those who are coming to you in the RCIA. And what I think the RCIA can do for Protestants in particular is it can help awaken the analogical imagination in them, in their hearts. It can help awaken the sacramental imagination in their hearts. Now, they may come to you with, very well versed in the Bible, although that's kind of a stereotype too. But still, they may come to you with a good understanding of even church history or doctrine. What they may be lacking is this analogical imagination, this way of looking at God as present in the world, and the joy and the beauty and the optimism that come from that, from being part of a community and not just being, individual Christians. The RCIA can help do this. How? Well, in the RCIA, there are all of these rites, these rituals. There is a lot of symbolic richness to the RCIA. So there's handing on the Our Father, although that's more to the unbaptized, but handing on the creed. There are the exorcisms. There's the rite of acceptance. There's the rite of sending. There's the rite of election with the bishop down at the cathedral. Not to mention the Easter Vigil and everything that happens there with full sacramental initiation into the church. Undergoing sacraments changes people. Undergoing ritual changes people. Having this symbolic prayer among the church community, it changes people. And one change that it engenders is it awakens. this analogical imagination, this Catholic view of things, that God is present in the world and that God comes to me, that God's grace comes to me through the good things of this earth. So the RCIA really can help Protestants see differently. It can teach them certain doctrines, and it should. I'm not saying that. I'm not denying that at all. But a lot of them may, if they're Episcopalian, if they're Lutheran, they may come with pretty much a very solid understanding of the basics of Christianity. What the RCIA can do for them, what you can do for them through the RCIA, is to help awaken this sacramental imagination, this way of seeing God's grace working in their lives in new ways than before. God's grace was working in them before they came to you as individuals. Now God can work through the community and their inclusion in the community and them being a part of the community. They say converts make the best Catholics, and maybe now we know why. It's this combination of the dialectical imagination that emphasizes the transcendence of God and personal integrity and responsibility and hard work. The dialectical is fused with the analogical imagination, that now, along with the personal code of holiness and righteousness and responsibility that a lot of good Protestants have, now they add to that the Catholic take on things, in which we're part of a community and we're part of the community of the saints and we're in this together, and that God works in and among and through us through the sacraments that Christ has given to us. So that's why converts make the best Catholics, because the dialectical and the analogical imagination are both operating in them. And that can happen. You can give that to people through the RCIA. Okay, there are other reading assignments on the syllabus that I think will continue to make these points about explaining the analogical and the dialectical imagination. So we'll do those reading assignments, and then we'll take up the conversation and the thread of discussion. Thanks very much for your attention on this module. Till the next time, goodbye and God bless.